Welcome, everyone, to the Most Notorious podcast. Your presence, as always, is very much appreciated. I am very happy to have as my guest today Janie Nesbitt Jones. She is a journalist and true crime writer and a consultant for investigation discovery. With her husband, Wyatt Jones, she has co-authored 2 books, Hiking Arkansas and Arkansas Curiosities. And she's here to talk about her latest book, entitled The Arkansas Hitchhike Killer, James Waybern Red Hall. Great to have you. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Sure. So as part of my preparation for an interview, I always do some research about the subject at hand outside of just reading the book, just to see what else has been written about it. But there's not a ton out there about Red Hall, is there?
No, there isn't. This is the first book to chronicle his life, so I'm pretty proud of that. It did take a lot of research.
How long have you been working on it?
Well, off and on, it wasn't. I wasn't to the point where I could work on it full time. So you know how life interferes sometimes, and sometimes I would take off like 6 months at a time. So it was over a period of, I would say, 5 years. And then I couldn't find a publisher at first. I was so lucky to find the History Press and Arcadia Publishing. They've been very good to me.
When did you realize that you had enough material to write a book?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the main characters in the book is a reporter. His name was Joe Werges. He was with the Arkansas Gazette, which was a morning paper. And Joe was a legend in his own time. He was on the police beat and he followed this case. He alone had exclusive interviews with Red Hall himself. And I went through all of Joe's newspaper articles. I could not have done the book without Joe Werges, I don't think. My other sources, though, included people who had known Red personally. Sadly, most of them are gone now. I also got a lot of information from the trial transcript. I learned a lot there. So, but yeah, it was Joe. Without Joe, I wouldn't have had enough material. All I had up until that point were from old detective magazines that I had gotten from a man named Patterson Smith. He's in New Jersey, and he has a vast collection of articles, newspaper and magazine articles, and books about true crime. So I got those old magazines from him. And I might back up a little bit. It was a friend of mine who first suggested writing an article about Red. At that time, and still, I'm a true crime writer for AY Magazine, which is based in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I was trying to think of another article subject, and my friend Wanda said, "Well, why don't you write about Red Hall?" And I said, "Who's Red Hall?" And all she could remember was that she was 10 years old when his trial took place, when he was captured and then his trial, because up until then, nobody knew they had this killer on the loose. But Wanda put me on the track. She knew it took place in 1945. She sent me to her cousin Jackie, who knew about the detective magazines. That put me into contact with Mr. Smith, Patterson Smith, and I was able to do the article for the magazine using all that. But then there came a point where I needed to take a little break from writing the articles, and I was casting around for ideas for a book. I knew I wanted to write one, and it was my husband, Wyatt Jones, who suggested Red Hall, and the light bulb went off, so I thought, yeah, why not Red?
Sure. So this is one of those serial killers that really requires a deep dive into their early history, right? that this was a guy who had a really rough upbringing.
Yes. He was the son of a preacher, a Baptist preacher, and his father was also a farmer. His mother was Eva Lorraine Ingram Hall, and his father was named Samuel Jerome Hall. His father was overly strict to the point of being cruel. And when Red was a little boy, he would run off at night, run out into the woods. And then he started going around the county. And then he started going all around the state. And by the time he was a teenager, he was going to other states all across the country. He would hop trains and hitchhike, but his first 11 murders, and he confessed to these, the first 11 murders, which took place in 1938, had nothing to do with hitchhiking. His first victim was a woman in Salina, Kansas, on North Santa Fe Avenue. And that was all I could find out about her because he just met her on the street. He said that she tried to rob him, but as you get to know Red, you realize that he was a pretty good liar. And he also said later that he couldn't remember their names. At one point, he said, "There are so many I can't remember." So the woman in Salina, Kansas, she remains unidentified. And then he went down to Arizona. He was working as a truck driver for a farm down there, and they had Mexican migrant farm workers employed there, and he killed 10 of those men. So that was 1938, and those were his first 11 murders.
And those migrant workers, they remain unidentified to today. But he said later that he basically just led them out into the desert, one by one, and robbed and murdered them.
Yes, sometimes he would shoot them, and sometimes he would just club them over the head. He was a very strong man. He could beat a person to death. I mean, he did, but that comes later. He was very strong. You knew never to get into a fight with Red. In fact, I talked to someone recently at a book signing, and he said that his father, I believe it was, once almost got into a fight with Red. They were going to fight it out, but he backed down. And I thought, well, that was a good idea to back down. He beat one guy so bad, the man was in the hospital for several months. It happened in an alley behind a bar in Little Rock. They arrested him, of course, for that. But when he came up against the judge listened to what he had to say, and Red told him that he was the son of a preacher and that he was a Navy veteran. He was married in 1939 to a woman named Walsey McKee. She was a little country girl, and they met at church. She lived with her mother, and she never got to go anywhere. She was unsophisticated. She was enthralled by Red's stories about his trips, the things he had seen. They got along so well. They were married in 1939, and they had two children. Unfortunately, one died at birth, but then they had a second son in 1943. All this time, though, Red was taking these trips. He would go off for weeks at a time. He would send Walsey picture postcards. She didn't like this, of course, because it left all the farming chores to her and her mother, who lived with them. And farming is hard work. And when it came time to put in the crops, or if it came time for harvest, they would have to go to her in-laws, to Red's family, for help. So she wasn't happy, but she just wasn't the type of personality to raise a stink over it. She was just meek and mild. But in the end, it wasn't Walsey who asked for a divorce. It was Red. He said that Walsey's mother stuck her nose into their business too much. So they divorced. But he always made sure that he sent back money, $10 a month, to help support their son. But that was after that, it was after his divorce that he was drafted into the Navy. And he went to their training camp, but he was discharged after only 6 weeks for what the Navy called indifference. He didn't know what that meant, but he figured it was the Navy's loss. And then in 1944, he met a girl named Waybern Clemens. It was a whirlwind courtship and marriage, and he found out pretty soon, though, that Waybern was nothing like Wolsey. She was feisty and independent. Red called her bullheaded. And when he went off on these trips, she insisted on going with him. Something happened on one of those trips, probably in Oregon, because later on he did allude to the fact that she knew too much. He never elaborated on that. We don't know what she might have seen or heard. He would knock her around a lot. Like I said, he was handy with his fists, and she would have bruises all over her when she would go back and visit her family on the farm. Then she left him around June of 1944. But unfortunately, she decided to give it one more chance, and she went back to him. And that was a fatal mistake. She moved back in with him, I think, around 1st of August in 1944. And that next month, in September, she wanted to go to a ballroom nightclub. It's kind of like a ballroom / nightclub. It was called the Rainbow Garden. And they had live music and entertainment there. Cab Calloway played there. The Dorsey brothers played there. But she wanted to go just to dance. It was a good place to go for dancing. She invited her friend Katie Bryant to go with them. And at the end of the evening, Faye's feet were killing her because she had bought some new shoes, but she hadn't broken them in. So after a night of dancing, she wanted to go down in the elevator. Red, out of meanness, I suppose, insisted on going down the stairs. And that is where the fight started. By the time they got out to the car and Katie was still with them, he hit Faye very hard, and she told him that she was leaving him. Well, they all got in the car, and he dropped Katie off at her place, and that was the last time anybody saw Faye alive. About 10 days after that night at the Rainbow Garden, Faye's family were concerned enough about her. They usually kept in touch, very close touch. They communicated with each other about every couple of days at least. So when they hadn't heard anything from her in 10 days, they decided to report her missing. So her mother and her sister, Imogene, went to the Little Rock Police Department, where they talked to the detective chief, O.N. Martin, and gave him the full story. The family had not been able to get in touch with Red. He was very elusive, but he couldn't get away from the cops. He was working as a taxi driver in Little Rock, and he was such a good taxi driver, he could still take off whenever he wanted to and go rambling about, because the cab company would rehire him every time. They said he was just so good. He was a little hard on the cars, on the equipment, but they really liked him there. So anyway, Chief Martin sent 2 of his best detectives, Herbert Peterson and Harold Judd, to talk to Red. So they went to the taxi station, and Red said, I don't know where she went. She left me that night, and I don't know where she is. They didn't have anything else to go on. So they kind of kept an eye on him, but, without any evidence, they couldn't do anything. After he murdered Waybern, a few months later, beginning in January 1945, Red went on a killing spree in Arkansas. And I think this was kind of unusual. My theory is that when he killed somebody he knew, Waybern, maybe even loved at one point, I think it shook him up so bad that it caused him to go on this spree. In January, he killed a barber bootlegger down in Camden, Arkansas. And then shortly after that, he killed a man named E.C. Adams. Mr. Adams was traveling from his home in Kansas to Camden, where they had an ordnance plant there, and he was going to get a job. He picked Red up just as he was leaving Little Rock, and then later that day, the police found his body off the side of the road near Fordyce, Arkansas. Red had shot him in the back of the head. Of course, the police didn't know who he was, but this allowed the state police to become involved. So you have two jurisdictions working on two different cases. Little Rock Police Department working on Faye's disappearance. The state police working on the hitchhike killings as they became known. Captain J. Earl Scroggin was the Arkansas State Police captain in Little Rock, and he was the one who headed up this case. Two of his best detectives were Homer Sims and Rhett Oliphant, and they backtracked Mr. Adams's trip. They went back to Kansas, and then they came on to Arkansas, checking in at different motor lodges, tourist courts, and that sort of thing, and stores. And they did find a trail where people had seen him, where he had stayed. And they found out that they knew that he probably picked the hitchhike killer up in Little Rock, but they didn't really get a clue until the next murder. The victim there was Doyle Mulherin. He was a truck driver for a meatpacking company, and his route was from Conway to Stuttgart. The people along his route, because he went on the same route at least a couple of times a week, people along his route recognized him. They knew him. They knew his truck. Two different witnesses said that on that day, they saw him struggling with a young man who had wavy red hair. In the cab of the truck, they were struggling. And they did find Mr. Mulherin's body shortly after that. He also had been shot in the back of the head. So that was the first clue. They got a little bit about what he looked like. He was getting very sloppy. Red usually picked places where they had like back roads, or out in Kansas. He loved Kansas because you could see motorists coming from a mile away, which gave him time to drag the bodies off into the ditch or whatever. But the next murder in Arkansas, he committed on Highway 65. And anybody in Arkansas knows that Highway 65 was one of the busiest highways in the state. It was down around Lake Conway. He had just pulled over to the side of this busy highway. And this man's name was J.D. Newcomb Jr. He was a boiler inspector for the Labor Department. And he had picked Red up at a place called Marche, south of Conway. And something happened, though. He may have made Newcomb nervous. For some reason, they pulled over on the side of this very busy highway. and they started struggling. Newcomb did have a chance. He was trying to get that gun. While this was going on, a car drove up and almost stopped. But the driver and the passenger were Mr. and Mrs. Earl Parks. They had a store, a business here in Conway, but they lived down south. So they were driving along there, and Mr. Parks started to stop. But his wife urged him to go on because she said, it's just a couple of drunks fighting it out. So they did drive on, and luckily they drove on because I know that Red would have killed them in a second. In fact, they would have witnessed the murder of J.D. Newcomb because it was probably mere seconds later that he got the upper hand and he shot Mr. Newcomb in the face, point blank, killed him instantly. The funny thing about Mr. Newcomb, aside from it happening on the side of a busy highway, was Red wanted to put, he said later in an interview, he wanted to put Mr. Newcomb's body in water somewhere. He went on through Conway, and if he'd taken a left, he could have gone to the Arkansas River and put the body in there. But he ended up going on this long, it was over 200, it was like 278 miles one way. He just kept carrying the body around in the car, and he would pass over like the Little Red River lakes and places like that. He just wasn't making any sense. But finally, his car, or Mr. Newcomb's car, I should say, had a flat tire. So Red had to pull it off the road, and he got off in a little glade for some cover. He took Mr. Newcomb's bluish gray coat, and he may have taken some money. And then he set fire to the car with Mr. Newcomb's body inside. Then he went to a place called Tumbling Shoals, and he flagged down a bus that was on its way back to Little Rock. When the state police investigated this case, all they could find from the passengers in the bus and the bus driver, they remembered him, but they couldn't give a description. They didn't know a name. They said he had on a bluish gray coat. So they knew that was Mr. Newcomb's coat. So, yeah, he did that.
So police were eventually able to connect a murder to Red Hall, courtesy of a man named Lonnie Blaine, specifically to his weapon.
Lonnie Blaine, yes. Lonnie Blaine was a taxi driver at that same company with Red. And Red asked Lonnie, could he borrow Lonnie's cab? And he told Lonnie that he had some business to do down in Camden with a bootlegger and barber. I think he just said bootlegger. So Lonnie let him borrow that car. Well, Lonnie always kept a 45 caliber gun in the little side pocket of the car door. And when Red returned the car the next day, Lonnie checked that gun and saw that 2 shots had been fired. Then he heard on the news about the victim in Camden, whose name was Carl Hamilton, the bootlegger. So Lonnie put 2 and 2 together, and he knew Red had done it. But he couldn't report that to the police because Lonnie himself had a criminal record. He was an ex-con, and he was afraid he would be implicated in that. He didn't tell anybody except for one woman, and it was either somebody like a sister or an aunt, maybe even his mother. I was never able to find out. He did confide in her. So that's important to remember. And then, along about this same time, Red got into that fight I was talking about earlier behind the bar where he beat the guy so bad. And he got off telling the judge that he was the son of a preacher and he was a Navy veteran. And the judge let him off with just a fine and court costs. So the Little Rock Police Department Detective Owen, they heard about that. And then it was along about that same time that Captain Scroggin with the state police got that tip. He got a tip on the phone from a woman, and it was the lady that Lonnie Blaine had been talking to. And that blew the case wide open. So that was the first time that the Little Rock Police Department and the state police knew they were after the same man for two different crimes. So it was unusual, I think, in that the two jurisdictions worked so well together. Sometimes you hear about police departments not working that well together. Sometimes one will want to take the credit, but not this time. They were super good, and they did go arrest Red, and they brought him in, and they let him stew a while in jail overnight. Then the next evening, they took him in for an interrogation, and everybody was there. Everybody who had been involved on the case, the detectives, the chiefs, the captain, and Joe Werges. So Joe was there even for the confession. It took a while. It took a while for him to confess, but Herbert Peterson, the detective Herbert Peterson, he was the one who finally got. He did get credit for that confession. And when they had him, and Red knew they had him, he just kind of rocked back in his chair and said, "Okay, you got me. I'll tell you all about them. I killed them all." And that's where he really started talking, and they couldn't shut him up. And then the next day after that, he led them to Fayrine's remains. He had taken her out on the old river road by the Riverside Golf Course. It was where water would come in, and he thought if the water didn't take away the remains, he figured he didn't bother to bury her. He just left her there. He figured the animals would take care of it. But he was able to lead them there. And then, with a little help from a woodcutter who lived right close to that spot, he had actually found the skull. He had found Fayrine's skull one day, and he didn't think anything about it. He just took it home with him and tossed it in the loft of his barn. And but then when they were out there looking, well, he came over to see what was going on, and they told him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I've got the skull up at the house." And then he said, "And I think the jawbone. I saw the jawbone, but I didn't take it. Let's see. I think it was over here somewhere." And sure enough, they find the Fayrine's jawbone. And that became part of the evidence in the trial that was to become, because she had a very distinctive buck tooth on her lower jaw. And that was important in the trial.
Also, when they nabbed him, they searched his home and found a lot of incriminating evidence, correct?
Yes, they did. It took two trips, actually. The first time they went, it was kind of funny. There was a magazine. It was a detective magazine on the table, well worn. You could tell he had read it a lot, and it was turned to a page that told about how you could change bullets so that ballistics tests would not be able to connect them to the same gun. He also had a Bible, which looked like it had never been opened. But they also found out the first time they went, they found a .32 caliber gun, but they found shells for a .38. They also found a part of Mr. Newcomb's car. It was a car seat, and he had stuck a watch inside there. But then, I think it was the same day or the next day, Detective Martin himself went back to the apartment, and he did a little bit more digging around in the dresser drawer, and he found that .38 between some shirts. So that was the main gun. The first gun was Lonnie Blaine's. That was a .45, but Red switched. The rest of the killings were done with that .38. And the ballistic expert with the state police was Alan Templeton, and he was able to match that .38 with all the rest of the ones that followed after Mr. Hamilton's murder. He knew the same gun killed Mr. Newcomb, Mr. Adams, and Mr. Mulherin. So they knew they had him on all of those crimes. And Red took them. He took all the lawmen and some reporters. More reporters were there for the finding of Fayrine's remains. But then the police wanted to be absolutely sure that they had enough on him. They didn't want anything to foul up the case against him. So he took them to all these murder scenes. And that's where you really get to know Red, because Joe Werges was in the car with him all the time. So, I said that Red liked to talk. So Joe really got to know him, and Red almost felt like the police were friends. He said they were a swell bunch of guys at one point. Until it came to the trial, and then he said they abused him in some way to get the confession. He said it was coerced, but they had enough witnesses, including Joe Werges, to say that it was not coerced. His lawyer, now that's an interesting character too. His name was M.V. Moody, and he tried every which way to get his client off. That part of the book is humorous, and I will say that there is humor in the book. It's not all grim, not all about dead bodies, especially when they're with Red out on the highways going to these crime scenes. And at one point, they stopped at the Cleburne County Courthouse, and Red had them open. It was a big window, because a crowd of about 500 people had gathered outside. The little communities were all close enough together. Word got around that Red Hall was in this motorcade. So they were there at the courthouse outside, and Red started talking to him from the window. And somebody said, "Who's your mother?" And Red would say, "Eva Lorraine Ingram." And the guy said, "That's what I thought. I know her." It reminded me of Charlie Starkweather. If you've ever watched that Terrence Malick movie, Badlands, and at the end of it, Starkweather was so nonchalant about everything. He was giving things away to the cops around him. And that's kind of the way Red ended up. Charlie Starkweather, he was kind of proud to leave. He wanted people to know his name and remember it. But Red didn't. That's the funny thing about Red Hall. He didn't do it for money. He never got very much. He didn't do it for sexual gratification. He just had a compulsion to kill. And some people, and I'm included in that, I think it might have been partly because of a head injury that he had suffered when he was about 12 years old. It was in a farming accident, although some people kind of whispered that his father might have hit him once too often and once too hard. But however it happened, he was unconscious for quite a while. And then it was several weeks, people said, before he was back to himself. And after that, they said he really wasn't ever himself again. So I tend to think that there was damage to the frontal lobe, maybe. That a lot of serial killers have that in common, head injuries. They also have abusive home lives. And Red's father was abusive, both psychologically, verbally, and physically. So Red kind of fits in with a lot of other serial killers. It's just that the reason there wasn't as much written about Red Hall was because it took place during the war, most of it. As I said, he started in 1938 killing people, but during the war, he just really revved up. He did confess to, a man in Texas. They never could verify that, but I do believe Red there. Some people say that he was sort of like Henry Lee Lucas. He started confessing to more crimes than he committed. I don't think so. I think he really did commit a lot more. And this was a surprise to the cops. They didn't know this until they were on one of those trips to a crime scene and they were coming back home. And Red said, there were more. And Peterson raised an eyebrow and said, more? How many are we talking about? And Red said, more like 24 and 12. And I had already counted up 17. It's pretty easy to count up to 17. There were the 10 in Arizona, the 1 in Salina, 5 in Arkansas. So, you've got a good start there. But I think he did kill a lot more. And when all of this did finally come out, lawmen from jurisdictions all over the country were interested. They were trying to clear some of their unsolved cases. And he fit the bill in a lot of them. And I think particularly in Oklahoma, I think if you really go to look at possibilities, possible victims, Oklahoma had a flurry of what they called hitchhike-related murders around Miami, Oklahoma, and there was a murder in Seminole, Oklahoma, that the sheriff there was, or actually it was the police chief, Jake Sims, who thought that Red was probably guilty of killing a man named Jim Owen there in Seminole because Jake Sims, he had seen Red. Red had been there several times, so Sims was familiar with him, and he said the more he talked to Red, the more he believed that he was the one who killed Jim Owen. I tried to get in touch with Owen's family. I was unsuccessful in doing that. I was able to connect to another family. Red was suspected of killing a Dr. Lambert, who had already picked up another hitchhiker named Corporal Nipper. I was able to talk to a cousin of Mr. Nipper's, and he told me that, yes, they thought that he must have been a victim of a serial killer because nobody was ever prosecuted in that case. So if he killed Nipper, he killed Lambert because they were together at the same time. And that is where it gets so sad. It's sad. It's funny at times. It's just it's a wild story, but it's true.
On that road trip that he took with police, he told them that part of what he believed made him a successful murderer was that he could talk people into doing what he wanted them to. He was very charismatic, very charming, right?
He was, and he wasn't bad looking. And he said, and it's not in the way you use your thumb or stand or anything like that. It's in the look you give them. And he's right about that. Yeah. He said one time, if you let me out here, I'll bet you I could walk up to somebody and ask for $20 and they give me $20. He was charismatic. He really was. But to me, I think he was a complete psychopath. In the book, I do go into quite some detail during the trial because Mr. Moody, his lawyer, pleaded insanity. And he was examined at the state hospital. And at the trial, it was sort of a battle of the psychiatrists. Each one would get up there and give their opinion as to his sanity and their definition of a psychopathic personality, mainly somebody who has no conscience. And Red admitted he had no conscience. He said that he had no compunction, I believe is the word he used, about killing anything. A cat, a human, In the early part of the book, I talk about how hog killing time on the farms was a cause for celebration. And Red's father was the one who actually killed the hog and then slit its throat and eviscerated it. And Red saw all that. And I think it desensitized him. And then after that, I think that may have happened before the head injury. And then after the head injury, that just removed all his inhibitions about carrying out these crimes that he did.
So there were, of course, prosecutors with really good cases against Red Hall based on his confessions, the physical evidence, and many of them could have gone after him for murder. But who was in the front of the line? Who was he ultimately tried for killing?
Waybern. Yes, there was some discussion from the different jurisdictions. The sheriff in Faulkner County wanted to try him here for Mr. Newcomb's murder because it happened in Faulkner County. But the prosecuting attorney in Little Rock, Sam Robinson, he thought they had the best case in Waybern's murder. They had recovered her remains. She was wearing a very distinctive clothing, and they had scraps of that. So that was something they could show the jury. And they also had her jawbone. See, Red and M.V. Moody kept saying, you can't prove that is Waybern. You can't prove that. That's just a piece of hair there. And somebody found this, and somebody else found this bone. Somebody found that bone. You can't say that this is Waybern. But they had the goods on him there in Pulaski County. And the thing was, they didn't want him to be tried in one county and get a life sentence there and then be tried in another for death, get the death penalty, because first he'd have to serve life and then he'd have to be executed. So, yeah, Mr. Robinson in Pulaski County had the strongest case. They weren't allowed to talk about any of the hitchhike killings in the trial. It was strictly Waybern.
So what did Hall's attorney do to try to establish him as insane?
He called several psychiatrists, well-known psychiatrists. They've been psychiatrists for decades. And like I said, it was kind of a battle between the psychiatrists because the prosecutor also had to put on psychiatrists to rebut the testimony given by the defense's psychiatrists. And there toward the end, Moody was getting pretty desperate. I mean, he was desperate. He really wanted to save the young man. Red, though, he he kind of caught on to really, I think, how he should have acted, because one of the psychiatrists who spent a very short time talking to him had said that Red now said that he had auditory hallucinations. That had never come up before. That was just something that Red came up with. He just made that up. But that Moody was just trying to drag it out, and in the end, that didn't really help. See, the reason he was never really known well, like I said, was because of the war. When the hitchhike-related killings were going on in the state, people didn't really pay that much attention, even in Arkansas, because they were concerned with the war. The war was coming to a close in Europe, and they were always looking at the newspapers, trying to learn more about what was happening, looking at the missing in action and all like that. And then the trial actually took place in May, and the trial was going on during VE Day. The war was over. So inside the courthouse was a very somber atmosphere, while on the outside, people were dancing in the streets, having a party out there because the war was over. And that is why he's not very well known. Today, I mean, there are a lot of serial killers, I know, and a lot of truck drivers, about that, I guess. Truck drivers are mobile, and I'm not saying all truck drivers, but people who are mobile, and with the interstate now the way it is, that's why you have so many with names like the I-95 killer, the Santa Rosa hitchhike killings, and various names like that.
So, would you talk about the verdict, the sentence, and the rest of Red Hall's short life?
Yeah, okay. The judge told the jury they could either find him guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity. They could show mercy, which would mean a life sentence. They could say without mercy, and that would be the death sentence. And that's what they came down with, was the death sentence. So they took him to Tucker prison. That's where the electric chair was. But the night before the execution, he was in a pretty good mood. He'd been a little bit nervous, but he calmed down, and he was real friendly with his jailers. And then he got to say his goodbyes to his family and to Fayreen's father. And with his family, he was joking around with one of his brothers. And then he told Mr. Clemens, Faye's father, that he was sorry, that it was an accident, but he also said, I didn't do it. I mean, he was like that. He would just go from one lie to another in the very next sentence. But Mr. Clemens, he tried to be forgiving, but he just couldn't. He did tell Red that he had no ill feelings toward Red's family, and that seemed to comfort Red a little bit. And of course, they shaved his head, and when it came time for the execution, he was just very calm. And there is a song, let me tell you about this. In the book, I mention a song that I was never able to trace. I had heard from my friend Wanda, the very source of this story, my friend Wanda. She said there had been a song written about him. I never could find out about that. Well, the book went to press, and then I find this Facebook message from a lady who knew that song. And the song is Just 13 Steps. That's the title, Just 13 Steps. You can listen to it on YouTube. The first person who wrote it or sang it, I don't know if he wrote it, Luke Gordon. The Oak Ridge Boys did a later version, but it's basically the same song, just 13 steps. And my husband wondered about that because it's usually 13 steps up to a hanging gallows, but in this case, they do mention that it's an electric chair, and it was just a short ways. It's like 13 steps away. So I wanted to tell you about that. But he was very calm. He walked right up to the chair. They strapped him in. They got him ready. There were a lot of witnesses there, but very quiet. And he didn't say a word. He did not say a word for once. And they covered his face, and he was executed. And then after the execution, back then, the state police, they had a tradition of making a plaster cast out of it's a death mask. A plaster cast would go over the executed man's face, and they would keep that death mask. And for the longest time, those death masks were kept by the state police. But a few years back, they were getting bad press, I guess, for that. And most of them just disappeared. I think they're in the hands of some former police, maybe. There were only two. There are only two left, and Reds was one of them. It had fallen off the wall at one time, so it broke a little bit, but they were able to repair it. So I have a picture of the death mask in the book, and it looks like he's grinning, but it's a grimace from when the electricity surged through his body. It's a grimace, but it does look like he's smiling through eternity there. And then after his execution, he was brought back to Faulkner County for burial. And I was able to talk to someone who knew Walsey, his first wife. She attended the funeral. It was in January 1946. It was hard to find flowers, but she said somebody found some red camellias. And she said that it was a graveside service, a gray velour coffin. And the interesting thing about Red's burial place is that he is buried in Marcus Hill Cemetery, not with his family, but very near to Walsey. Walsey married again, but she died in 2000. And when she died, she was buried there, and her grave is separated from Red's grave by her mother's. And I thought that just spoke volumes. She must have still loved him in some way. I just thought that was so interesting that she's buried so close to him, and that her mother is the one between. And then there's a little stone, a little flat stone marker without a name, but I think that's probably the baby who died at birth. But his family, they're buried somewhere else. And when I started writing this book, I did talk to his relatives. I talked to a cousin, and I talked to a nephew. And the nephew said that his mother, who was married to one of Red's brothers, his mother would never allow him to learn anything about Red, about his uncle. And that he committed suicide. One of Red's brothers committed suicide. And one contact I tried to make was a sister. I happened to go to school with a relative of theirs. And at first they said yes, but then they said no. Or actually, they didn't say no. They just didn't ever get back to me after my second request. And I can understand that. I understand. But their son, Walsey and Red's son, he grew up. He had a family. He was in the Air Force, but he died at the age of 29. He was just a few weeks shy of his 30th birthday. I found out after the book went to press that he died of a heart attack, but that's all I know. I do know where his grandchildren, I do know where they are. I deliberately leave them out because they may not know who their grandfather was. And I don't think he would want them to know.
So, what in your mind made Red Hall a serial killer?
I do believe it had a lot to do with the head injury and the abuse that he suffered at home at the hands of his father. He was just, when he had that head injury, it cut off the inhibitions that he had that would have controlled what he did. But it's so common among serial killers that I have to believe it was partly. And this was in court, you see. And one thing I don't always mention, and I forget about this, Jackie Anthony. Now he knew Red when Jackie would have been. Jackie was about 16 years old, and he and a friend had gone to Oklahoma. They were in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. It was twilight time, and they were outside enjoying the evening, and they saw this guy coming toward them. And Jackie said that Red always sort of led with his left side, sideways almost. And that, I think, is also an indication of some sort of neurological disturbance, probably caused from that accident, caused by it. So it would be, I just think that it was a combination of the physical, the neurological disturbance in the brain, combined with the abuse at home.
So, as far as the definition of a serial killer, there are different definitions out there. Hall was a little bit different than what people generally consider to be the norm for serial killers. There was no sexual gratification element to it, as you've said, no drawn-out torture, just him and a gun, basically, and a compulsion.
Right. It was either with a gun. He did beat some of his victims, like Fayreen. He did beat her to death with his bare hands. But no, he never tortured. No. They were interested in him in that Frome case from Texas, the woman and her daughter who were killed down there. And it had long been unsolved. And the Texas Rangers came up to talk to Red. But I believe that they were killed by somebody in the drug trade because they were tortured, and their car was torn up like somebody was looking for something hidden in the car. And that really sounds like drug smugglers. They mistook the lady's car for a car belonging to what they call a mule, somebody smuggling drugs, because that was not Red Hall style. No, he did not torture. But serial killers interest me, the psychology of it all, and also down through history. I do write about that a little bit. One reason I became interested in true crime was the Boston Strangler. I'm getting on up in years, Eric, and yes, I do remember the Boston Strangler. And I used to love to watch the Walter Cronkite news in the evening when I was like 11, 12, something like that. And I remember so specifically the first time I ever heard about the Boston Strangler, and it was Walter Cronkite. There was some grainy film footage, black and white, of course, of somebody, a dead person, being rolled out on a gurney under a sheet, and Cronkite saying, another victim of the so-called Boston Strangler. The Boston Strangler was interesting because he was the first one who was ever really covered by television. He was the first one covered by television. I mean, that's just so interesting to me. It was almost like they were celebrities, like you had movie stars, you had TV actors, you had entertainers, politicians, sports figures, and then along comes the Boston Strangler, followed by way too many serial killers. Supposedly, there are about 50 serial killers working in the United States at any given time. And I read somewhere too that if you walked past 1,000 people on the sidewalk, one of them would be a serial killer. I don't know how true that is, but I thought it was interesting.
Sure. So again, your book is entitled The Arkansas Hitchhike Killer, James Waybern Red Hall. And the book is pretty much everywhere books are sold, right?
Yes, it's available in some libraries. I hope to get it better distributed through libraries too, but brick and mortar stores, a lot of different places online. Amazon is just one. So yes, it's available out there. And I'm available for speaking engagements and book signings.
How can people reach you?
Right now, the best way would be through Twitter. I don't have my website up yet. And at Twitter, Janie Jones 1230.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Revenis, and have a safe tomorrow.